Welcome back to Politics Tonight. Thank you so much for staying with us. Now let's get to our interview with the guest of the day. I am joined by the Director of Programs for Yaga Africa, Cynthia Mbamalu. Tonight we're discussing Kogi, Bayelsa, Imo polls and assessing INEC's performance. Thank you so much for joining us, madam.
Thank you and good evening.
Good evening to you. So this first set of off-cycle elections in Kogi, Bayelsa and Imo states have been concluded. Let me have your first impression about the conduct.
Well, I guess first is to commend the people, the voters, especially in Imo, in Bayelsa, and in Kogi State, for coming out to vote, regardless of some of the difficult challenges in the elections. If you remember the pre-election assessment, in Imo, for instance, one of the major challenges was the issues around insecurity in the state and the spate of violence across some local government areas. But regardless, we still had voters who turned out to vote. And so I think the first commendation for me is to the voters and the people of Bayelsa, Imo, and Kogi State. Now, on the general conversation around the conduct of the elections, for those who followed a lot of our pre-elections assessment and our elections day assessment, I would say that, one, I'll look at this from different aspects. I'll look at issues around logistics management before I go into the election day process in particular. I think there was a marked improvement when it came to logistics management as it relates to deployment of materials and personnel to respective polling units. I say marked improvement, and I say this with some level of caution, and because we still had polls that did not open or opened as late as 11 a.m. However, if we look at our general assessment, especially for Imo and Kogi State, at least by 9:30 a.m., over about 50% plus of the polling units had opened in Kogi State, and if you move it to 10 a.m., you had about over 50% of polling units opened in Imo State. So what is that indicating? That you had some measure of improvement in logistics deployment, especially because of the context of insecurity within the respective states. And also, if you look at issues around INEC's response to some emerging trends on election day, I would say one positive was in Kogi, when at the commencement of polls, we had received reports from observers in Kogi State that there were pre-filled results sheets, which were at the polling units already pre-filled before even commencement of accreditation and voting. And we had immediately escalated that to the Electoral Commission, and INEC had called for the suspension of elections in those respective wards within the LGAs where these were prevalent, and the process was suspended, and INEC had issued a statement indicating that it would investigate what happened and that the culprit will be duly sanctioned. And because for us, that was a major act of electoral fraud, that even before elections had commenced, that some locations had results sheets that were pre-filled. But at least having the commission respond immediately to the concern, I think that was one of those positives you would say. And I think generally the fact that we did not have a lot of incidences of electoral violence, especially coming from the general elections we had in February and March, there were lots of worry that there could be high spate of electoral violence in these elections. But if you observe for the respective states, there were some isolated cases, but not as widespread as was expected. And I think that in itself also showed some level of improvement on how the security managed the process. However, for these elections, I do believe that these elections was, I would say, based on our assessment, especially as Yaga Africa, it was a lost opportunity for us as a people to rebuild trust in the elections and even to rebuild trust in state institutions like the Electoral Commission and the security agencies. And I say that because this is the first off-cycle elections to be conducted after the general elections. And with the controversies and the contentions of the previous elections, there were lots of expectations in these elections, as having that level of diligent compliance to the electoral laws, electoral law, that Electoral Act, and the guidelines on elections. That was one expectation from a lot of citizens in these 3 elections. The other expectation was that the political actors would play fairly and would adhere to the rules of the game. But we also saw that that particular expectation not met. And then I think the third for us is the role the institutions play. So the role of the Electoral Commission and the role of security agencies. So if you put all of this, while we had some if some level of positives, but there was a lot to be desired, and I do believe that these elections was a lost opportunity. And as a people, actually, as a people, we need to review what we accept as minimum standards of electoral integrity, because it seems like with every elections, the bar is lowered. And I think that in itself is a threat to democracy. That in itself impacts on the level of trust in elections and even in democracy as a system of government. And though elections may not equate democracy, we do believe that getting elections right would build confidence in the people that democracy is truly for the people of Nigeria. So if you ask me, those would be my general assessments, and I can go further to highlight areas that we observed in these states that had elections that led to our final assessment of the process.
So your organization, in a statement released, says INEC missed the opportunity to rebuild citizens' trust in the election. But other observers gave INEC a pass mark, especially because this is the first time INEC will be conducting 3 off-cycle elections simultaneously across 3 geopolitical zones.
Well, yeah. So if we're looking at let's just why conducting 3 off-cycle elections is not something we do not expect the Electoral Commission to be able to achieve. Why? And because for general elections, we have governorship elections conducted on the same day across over 20 states, including state assembly elections. And this is the same Electoral Commission. And this time there's actually more resources at its disposal. And because all the commission needs to focus on is to deploy its arsenals to 3 states. And so for us, when you engage on elections and you observe the process, you would say that there is an expectation that if the focus is just 3 states and every resources that is needed is made available, including the support of the security agencies, then there is a lot more desired from the outcome or desired from the process. And so for this level of assessment, why we are not quick to celebrate this as a major win for electoral processes, because there was a higher expectation, because you had 3 states and all the commission had to focus on was getting these 3 states right and planning for the elections. There was an ample time to plan for the elections. Unlike the March elections, where elections were held at the same time across over 26 states, including legislative elections. So permit us if we're not quick to celebrate, especially because I think for Nigerians, for a lot of us who engage the process, there is that sense of when you invest in the process, you expect some level of returns. So if we give examples of some of the things we did observing in some of the states, and I would focus more on Imo and Kogi states, because that was where we deployed the process and results verification for transparency methodology, the PRVT, where we had about 600 sample polling units in both states. So we had over 300 observers in both states. So we can give better assessment of those elections. In Bayelsa, we had fewer numbers of observers, so we just had 9 traditional observers. And so we may not be able to give an in-depth assessment of the overall conduct of the election. But for these 2 states, just as simple as Imo State, our data showed that 12% of our sampled polling units did not have elections conducted at the polling unit. One particular local government was more worrying. Osu local government, for instance, where we had more of our sample polling units where elections did not hold. Now, there were speculations that the voting may have been moved to another location, a central location. However, there was no communication to voters. There was no press statement. You could check all of INEC's communication on elections day. There was no official communication to states that because of insecurity or whatsoever reason it may have been, that the elections in these local governments be conducted in this particular location so that voters can access that. So if we compare this with Anambra, that almost had the same security context with Imo State, if you remember that in Anambra governorship elections in 2021, the elections for Ihiala was done on a different day because of the insecurity and the threat of violence in Ihiala. And the Electoral Commission have communicated that to protect personnel and materials and to ensure that with security was not distracted, that the elections in Ihiala would be done on a later date. So there was due communication, but you could imagine that in this situation, we had sample points. And when I say our sample point, it means there could be more, but I'm focusing based on the locations where we have the exact data. Elections did not hold there. However, by the close of polls, we were tracking the result portal, and there were results from some of these locations. So it immediately raised an integrity question. So if there were elections, if elections were not held in some of these locations, why are the results sheets emanating from these locations? That is one. Also, it's just an example because we had in other local government beyond us. So we had in Okigwe, we had locations in Olu, in Oru West, in Owerri West, and where the elections were not held. However, regardless of that, we saw that results got from that. So that is just an example because we said in 12% of our sample polling units in Imo State. And the question is, we asked the commission to provide clarity on what really happened with that regard. This was also an election where there were pre-filled result sheets before the commencement of an election. Now we've seen different levels of malpractices, but this raises a bigger question of integrity because if we did an assessment of the results sheets that were completed, they were completed with some level of knowledge ahead of the elections. When I say level of knowledge, there are things we assess, things as simple as the figure on registered voters, the polling units data, and what have you. We did a comparison with the official register of voters. These numbers were accurate, so it meant that there was that intentionality to commit electoral fraud by whomever completed this result sheet. However, these result sheets are document sensitive elections materials that are in the custody of the Electoral Commission and its officers. So meaning it is in the custody of internal personnel. And for the elections, the Electoral Commission had told us that the SPOs would be permanent staff of INEC, not ad hoc staff. So the bigger question is, what was the role of the electoral officer in respective local government to look into that? What was the role of the SPO, who is ordinarily a permanent staff of the Electoral Commission? And then what was the oversight framework that these instances happened? So imagine if observers did not catch that. That in itself creates a credibility question. So let's look at another issue. The other issue is around counting the election day process. We still got report that in some locations, the BVAS was bypassed for an election conducted after the general elections where we celebrated a new electoral act that makes the BVAS mandatory. So if a BVAS is mandatory as a matter of law, not a matter of policy, how was it possible that some locations where INEC deployed its trained staff could bypass the BVAS? You could say it was in isolated cases, but the fact it happened showed that there was something, that there was a challenge with that, because we expect that at this point, in the general elections, we had better data on almost 99% usage or more of the BVAS across polling units. So that is also a matter that requires some level of investigation. And I think one thing we need to understand when it comes to the process, voters and citizens need to see in itself and believe that it is transparent. Because when it comes to elections, perception is everything. So it's not just that the process is transparent, but that it is seen to be transparent. So if we look at the value chain on elections day, the deployment of materials, the commencement of the process, the voting at respective polling units where it is designated that voters would vote, and then the process of counting and accounting of ballots. If we carefully assess that, there were instances where certain polling units, voting happened in a location and results were counted in a different location. Certain polling units, the process was disrupted and the results were counted in a different location. So the question is, The guideline provides if the process is disrupted, there's an expectation that results for that polling unit is cancelled. So there's also that bigger question on why did we have this disparity in the application of guidelines? And so that for us is something that needs to be deeply investigated. And we call on INEC to audit these instances, and for the personnel that are found wanting, that they are sanctioned, because the sanctity of our electoral process is very important to assess our democratic development as a people.
All right, so let's go back to some of the issues you've raised. And speaking broadly to the issue of integrity, INEC promised to upload results of the elections on IREF, which the Commission fulfilled. How long can this go in rebuilding confidence in the electoral body?
Yes, I think the first thing is to commend the Commission for complying with that particular commitment to upload results on the result portal. We also were tracking how the results were uploaded. And I think the first part is, thankfully for these elections, there was no technological glitch. And so that is something that the Commission needs to improve upon. However, there's something about ensuring that while you do not have technological glitch, that there's also integrity in the process. And so if you go on the portal and you download results, there are some locations where some of the result sheets are not legible, so you cannot read what is on it. Some of the result sheets have data that are numbers that are inflated. Inflated in the sense that in comparison with some of our data on accredited voters, the data that was recorded as accredited voters, as was on the BVAS, is lesser than the number recorded as accredited voters on the result sheet uploaded. We downloaded some of the result sheets, and some of them did not have the signatures or the counter signatures of party agents. Now, every result sheet is supposed to be countersigned by party agents at polling units. At least our data showed that you had party agents deployed. It's not possible that you have several polling units that had no party agents, not even the ruling party in respective states. So the question was, where did that result emanate from, especially for a result that seemed like they were compiled by one individual. So we downloaded some results. It seemed like one person compiled that result sheet. And so to build trust in that process is beyond technological glitch. We need INEC to improve on that. First, the platform works. But secondly, that the results uploaded are actually the accurate result sheets from the polling unit, and that those result sheets are in line with the guidelines, that they are duly signed, stamped, and dated. The numbers are properly computed, that the numbers are not mutilated, and that it is not done by one person, because we only have one presiding officer in respective polling units, and it's expected that result sheet is completed by one person, and you do not have a situation where you have multiple officers with exactly the same handwriting. So we also need to ensure that INEC looks into those kinds of instances.
Right. So there were apprehensions about violence on election day. How much would you say this manifested on polling day?
Well, like I mentioned in my general assessment, I think first, we noted that we did not have a lot of reports on incidents of election day violence. And this in itself shows, one, that you had it's more like a testament to the work the security agencies did in the elections. You had the police. The police is the lead security agents when it comes to election security. And so you can say that with the work that was done, their efforts did limit the instances of violence. Like I mentioned initially, there was a lot of worry for Imo State because of the complexities and the insecurity in the state. However, we did not have a lot of reports around electoral violence. We're hoping that for subsequent elections, we would even get to a situation where we have no reports at all on electoral violence. So for that, I would say, thankfully, we do not have a lot of reports of citizens losing their lives or in elections or getting injured in elections. I think the major reports we received were more around reports of intimidation and harassment of voters by some party agents and thugs in some locations. And there was also the incident of the kidnap of the electoral, the INEC official in Bayelsa. Those instances are also things within the purview of the security agencies, because they have that responsibility to secure and protect lives in the elections. And so while we can say that this election, thankfully, we did not have a lot of reports of, violence or deaths of citizens, we also call on the security agencies to improve that. It also includes protecting voters from intimidation, protecting INEC officials from violence and intimidation or kidnap, because everyone that works on the election is a citizen, and everyone that works on the election deserves to be safe and secure in the process of voting.
So lastly, before I let you go, voter apathy is still a major issue. What's your reaction to that, and how do you think we can get over this huge challenge?
I think first, as Nigerians, we need that consciousness that one, we have a responsibility to build our democracy, to build our system. I know it's always easy for us to make comparisons with other countries or other maybe developed countries or even other countries within the continent. But the responsibility of building a democracy is a joint responsibility beyond the institutions. The role of the people is to continually hold the institutions to account, meaning that our exclusion or staying away from elections does not serve the need of anyone. And so as Nigerians, as citizens, we have to rebuild that consciousness on the importance of our constitutional right to vote and participate in the elections, regardless of the hardship. And because the more we stay away, the more the system produces people that may not represent the interests that we are seeking to achieve. But if we all vote, then it gets us to work. So that's the first part. The other part is it doesn't stop at voting. After voting, once leaders are elected, we need to consciously remain awake to our duties to holding our leaders to account. But the major responsibility is on the state institutions. Why? Because one of the things we're seeing beyond voter apathy is more around resistance to participate. Because you have a lot of people who are also feeling they feel some level of disappointment and disillusionment and despair with the system. And when citizens begin to lose trust or begin to remain in despair, it also affects the level of participation. How can we address that? It's on the government, our state institutions. For elections, we have INEC, security agencies, the federal and state government, including the legislative arm of government that is responsible for lawmaking, to begin to rebuild trust and rebuild trust in the citizens, but also rebuild the relationship between the state and the people through their actions and through the political will to truly reform our process. Because if people that wanted to vote in this election, for instance, there are locations where voters did not get to vote. They turned out to vote, but they couldn't vote for no cause of theirs. Imagine those voters next elections will not be inspired to come out. There are places where people wanted to vote but were intimidated, or the process in itself was not transparent. It also affects the interest. So in dealing with issues around apathy, we should look at it from a broader prism that is beyond apathy. It's more around people's voter disillusionment, voter fatigue, and despair in the system. And so there is that responsibility on our government for the sake of our democracy to change the way they engage the political system, to begin to reinvest in building trust and rebuilding relationships with the people, especially in reforming our process in a way that it truly guarantees that the votes of the people count and that the government in itself is a reflection of the will of the people and it meets the needs of the people. And I say this because we've seen the instances of coup d'etats within West Africa. We're seeing more people, citizens within the continent, questioning the idea of democracy. Even within Nigeria, people who are saying democracy does not work for us. And so we need to begin to make a case that democracy does work. But the only way we can show that democracy does work is to ensure that institutions serve the needs serve the needs of the people, that the government is for the people and not a government that exists to oppress the people. And so that, for me, is one of the ways to address issues of apathy. We need our state institutions to begin to speak and to act in the lines of our constitutional requirements and to rebuild the trust that the people would have in the system.
All right. Thank you so much, Cynthia Mbamalu, Director of Programs for Yaga Africa. Thank you so much for joining us on Politics Tonight. Thank you.